Welcome to Paying Attention, how to take your customers from deluded to devoted. Now, we're not suggesting, I hope, that all your customers are deluded or anything like that, but then at one extreme there might be the deluded customer who feels let down and didn't get quite what they wanted. And at the other end, the devoted customer. We got Richard from O2 talking about fans, the person who so loves you that they'll stand up for your mistakes. And what we want to talk about today is making that journey for how we move along the trajectory from the deluded to the devoted, and we think the answer is by paying attention. So the journey we're going to go through is start off briefly on what is the business case, but I suspect most of you know that more than anybody else, so we're not going to spend too much time on that. But what's going wrong? Why are we not delivering the customer impact we want? What do we need to do? The standing to attention, why paying attention matters. The drivers, what is it that we can do to get that attention to happen, to get further towards customer devotion. And then finally just a case study or two about putting it into practice and people who've done it. But the real case study is going to come firstly from our panel and secondly from all of you. So that's the journey we're going to be going on. Business case, there is an enormous amount of data that shows that focusing on, and I remember working with John Kay, who's a professor of Oxford Business School, Say Business School, and he had some research that showed that customers, the organizations that focused on customers outperform those who focus on the bottom line. And I remember working with a Barclays business bank executive on this, and the finance director was like, how can that be true? Surely if you focus on the bottom line, you get the best bottom line results. I'm like, well, no. Look at the data. And the data again and again shares that. Here's a study from the States. The yellow boxes are the ones that have the best customer service, and the blue boxes are the S&P 500 average, and you'll see that those with the yellow boxes, the ones with the best customer service, invariably perform better than the S&P 500. But there are plenty more places, and there's more in the report about different studies that show that. But the bit that we found most interesting as we started to inquire into this, and I think talking to some of you, reasons why some of you have come along this morning, was about the issue of what we think we're giving to customers versus what they think they're getting from us. And here, this is a study of 300 organizations, and we went to ask, do you think you're giving customers superior customer service? And a phenomenal 80% said, yes, we're giving our customers superior customer service. And then they went and asked the customers, what do you think? And a mere 8% thought they were getting superior customer service. So it's this perception gap that we're really fascinated by here. There's something in psychology called a self-enhancement bias. We all think we're slightly better than other people think we are. Yeah. You ask people, how trustworthy are you? Everyone rates themselves slightly higher, and the other person who's supposed to trust them rates them slightly lower. That's kind of normal. But this is not a self-enhancement bias. This is just a massive, great, gaping chasm. So what we're about this morning and the research that we're doing in our conversations with you is about how do we close this gap. And that's not just by asking customers not to expect superior customer service, but it's more obviously about how we push the other way. But before we get into that, I'm going to ask Seb to talk a little bit about what has gone wrong.
Thank you. Good morning everybody. So what I'm going to share with you now are the 6 reasons why we believe, and this is based on the academic research and the applied research, about why this perception gap exists. And the first reason is the fact that frontline aren't present, let alone prescient. So they're not actually necessarily paying attention or thinking about the customer. And I think the best way to illustrate this is I'm going to show you a video clip. And let me explain the backstory. So the backstory is a musician in the United States. His name is Dave Carroll. And the States is a big, I'm living there at the moment, it's a big country. You spend a lot of time on aeroplanes. And the bins, they call them the bins, where you put your luggage above your head, are quite small. Now, if you're, they talk about musicians spending a lot of time on the road. What that actually means in practice is you spend a lot of time on planes. And the bins are too small to put guitars. And musicians really, really care about their guitars. And this is Dave Carroll's story. Have you seen this? This is Dave Carroll's story of what happened when he checked his guitar.
I flew United Airlines on my way to Nebraska. The plane departed Halifax, connecting in Chicago's O'Hare. While on the ground, a passenger said from the seat behind me, my God, they're throwing guitars out there. The band and I exchanged a look, best described as terror, at the action on the tarmac knowing whose projectiles these would be. So before I left Chicago, I alerted 3 employees who showed complete indifference towards me. United, united, you broke my Taylor guitar. United, united, some big help you are. You broke it, you should fix it. You're liable, just admit it. I should have flown with someone else or gone by car. 'Cause United breaks guitars. When
I mean, it's a fantastic clip. We've all heard the story about the fact that, you know, if a customer is dissatisfied, they tell 11 people or 17 people. 11 million people have watched that clip. 11 million. So it also gives us a little bit of a sense of the virality of these clips. But I don't actually think the 11 million people is the interesting part of this. The interesting part of this is how he talks about the 3 people who just demonstrated indifference. That's actually, I think, the really interesting part of that clip. And if you watch the full movie, it's 4 minutes, he actually goes on to name someone. He said, I ended up speaking to Mrs. Irwin, and she just treated, I'm slightly paraphrasing here, she just treated me really badly, and that was the thing that most upset me. And Mrs. Irwin becomes a bit of a flashpoint for poor customer service on the internet. And so, you know, everyone's talking about Mrs. Irwin and how she doesn't care. And actually, Dave Carroll ends up making another video apologizing to Mrs. Irwin about mentioning her. You know, so there's and saying, you know, that it was United Systems and Processes. But the point was made actually about the individual indifference here that was the key issue. So that's the first reason why there's this gap. The second thing is that you could say, well, but surely Mrs. Irwin cared about it. Surely those 3 people cared. Well, actually, what people seem to think, and Octavius made this point a second ago, is the problem's everybody else. You know? And we did some research with one of UK's utility firms. And we asked them, okay, so how good do you think you are at building trust, about making things easy for customers, and about caring about them? And in the green boxes, the green bars, oh, how good they said they were. And then we said, now rate your colleagues. How good do you think everybody else is? And they said, well, actually, my colleagues really aren't as good as me. They're really not. And so what we find, and this is the self-enhancement bias, we find that attending to customers joins driving, sense of humor, and lovemaking as things that we massively overestimate our own ability for. You know? So that's the second one, this idea of the problem is everybody else. The third issue is that we have too much stick and not enough carrot. Complaints league tables, negative mystery shopping, calls where the feedback focuses on what the person's gone wrong. And so what happens, of course, is that it creates actually a bit of an environment, a bit of atmosphere of negative emotion. And I'm sure we've all heard the phrase infectious laughter before. The thing about emotion, psychologists call this emotional contagion. We pass our emotions on to other people. You know, in the same way that we can catch a cold, you catch a yawn, and catch emotion. And so what we do is we set up a culture of negative emotions, and guess what? That gets passed on to customers. And actually, in many respects, is that the manager makes a very significant difference in that. If the manager is starting to be upbeat and positive and optimistic, then those emotions are then translated through to everybody else. So on the point of the manager, the frontline managers are actually led to care in some respects more about targets than they are about their people. You know? So what we do is we focus on the targets, and what we don't think about is how we can actually change and shift people's mentality in many respects about what the job is, so that they can focus on the people first. And this next point, why is that? Why is that? Partly it's because about what leaders talk about, and therefore what managers and individuals attend to. And ultimately, leaders don't talk to or about customers that much. We talk about it, or leaders talk about it in quite abstract terms. We talk about accounts. We talk about stages in the pipeline. We talk about targets. We talk about metrics. But do we bring the customer to life in the right way? And in a recent Harvard Business Review article, they talked about leaders having strategic attention deficit disorder. Customer service comes first, but so does safety, so does sales, so does supplier management, so does headcount, so does cost, and it depends on the target or the metric that they're most worried about becomes the key strategic priority. So those are the 6 reasons why we believe that from the research, both academic and applied, we believe that there is this gap in terms of perception, in terms of the way in which customer experience is managed. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Octavius to introduce how we can start to solve it.
The problem, what do we do about it? And I think the piece we come here, that's why we've called the paper Paying Attention, is at the heart of this, no matter what we want our customers to experience, the attention that's paid to them at that moment of truth, at that moment of connection, when they meet someone from our organization, that is the bit that seems to have by far the greatest delta on their decisions to buy, stay, and so on and so forth. So I thought we'd share a couple of bits of research on this. There's plenty more again in the paper. But again, as I said, science is sexy and research we trust. So here's an interesting finding from 3,000 branch customers from a European bank. And they looked at the moments of truth, that moment where you meet someone in the branch and what was the experience like. And if it was a positive one, if the person was attentive, in 85% of cases, the customer either invested more or deepened their financial relationship with the bank. I mean, that's enormous. 85%, in effect, spent more, increased their basket size, depending on what industry you're in. But when the effect was neutral or negative, an amazing 70% actually reduced their involvement. So the basket size was directly affected by the attentiveness of the customers. So there's something interesting about how much we spend by the attentiveness of the frontline employee in those moments of truth with customers. But we also, one of the things we know is when customers leave, it's really expensive to get them back. There's 5 and 8 and other numbers as a multiple of how much it costs to get a new customer in versus sell more to an existing one. So we then thought, isn't it interesting, what is it that gets customers to leave? And the American Quality Association, in conjunction with the Disney Institute, did a massive study on this. And they grouped the reasons why customers leave into 4 categories. The first is that the competition have got something better. The second, what we call other there, is like life reasons why they would leave. The third reason is product dissatisfaction. And the fourth is the attitude of indifference by the person I met that represented the organization. If you imagine these were all equal, which one do you think is the most significant? And looking around the room, I'd say we have about 75% on the indifferent employee. Now, I'll give you a clue. The theme of this talk is paying attention, and the theme of research is about inattentive employees. So those of you in the 75%, you're paying attention, you're on the money, you're absolutely right. Now, the next question is, how right are you? So if all of these 4 were the same, they'd be 25% each. Now, we know they're not all the same, because I've already told you that the inattentive employee is the biggest one. The actual figure is 66%. So this is just phenomenal. We think the reason people leave is they don't like our stuff, whether the customer proposition, the marketing team's got it wrong, the competitors come in with something else. But actually, it's the indifference of the frontline employee. The experience of David Carroll and his guitar. And actually, the problem wasn't the guitar was broken, that was bad enough, but it was the attitude of everybody that came off the back of that. And this attitude makes people properly angry. And that's why we've called it deluded, because people feel they've been properly let down by the experience they were hoping to have. And so what I think we're talking about here when we look at how do we change customer service, how do we change that perception gap, is we are not talking about customer heroics. We've all heard the story of the FedEx person who swam across the channel carrying a wedding dress to get to someone on time. All these other great stories. But this is not what will transform that perception gap. It will create some great myths and some great stories, but that's not the behavior we want to be encouraging. And I think our way of looking at this is if we imagine, very simply, because kind of simple people here at Mind Gym, is that negative, this is the bad experience. Then there's indifferent, which is what we've been talking about. Then there's attentive, and then there's the heroic. Our view is that many organizations where there's the big perception gap are sort of shaped like this. Yes, there are some people who are doing really negative, terrible things, but there aren't that many of them. But the challenge is the vast bulk are in the inattentive. Their mind's slightly... There's a guy called Michael Killingsworth done some research that suggests that 50% of our time at work, our mind is distracted onto something else. mainly out-of-work things. So there's, again, a lot of research that kind of suggests this is very likely to be the case. And the challenge is not to boost up the heroic figure, but basically to move the bulk from indifference to attentive. And that's really what we think is the key to how we close that perception gap. How do we get the attention rather than following the process? I thought I'd share with you briefly now, and then with Seb, the 5 things that we see to help us on the journey. We're a little kind of deluded at one end and devoted at the other. The first thing is around building belief. I'll talk about that in a moment. The second thing is talking about customers. The third is treating others internally as they would like them to treat our customers. The fourth is about frontline know-how. And then finally, how do we coach to flourish? So I'll very briefly touch on each of those. The first one around belief. And it doesn't matter what the customer service proposition is. But if you say you want to be world-class, then mean it. Or if it's something else, then be clear about that too. But the most important thing is that people believe, the leaders believe in the outcome, in the customer proposition. Our colleague was working with Bob Ayling at British Airways when he was the CEO there. And he said to Bob, what's your plan, what's your strategy? And Bob said, well, it's the 3 C's. 3 C's, that could be okay. But the problem was that none of them stood for customer. Cost, capacity, or something else. So you kind of think, well, what is the message that the leaders are sending out that means that we should believe that customer really is the #1 priority? And actually, though the phrases customer first, customer #1, customer centric all sound quite bland, it's not the words that make the difference. It's the behaviors and the consistency of those behaviors. So when Seb shared from the utility earlier, I think I'm twice as good as the rest of the organization. How we get people to shift, to lean in and say, actually, I'll make more effort. One of those things is believing the leaders are serious about this, and the person in the call center or the person in the shop or the engineer on the road is also going to lean in as well. Well, customer service, when you think you're twice as good as the rest of the organization, that's massive. So the core is helping people believe that the customer really is the #1, and this is what the customer vision looks like. And the most important thing is sticking to it. I remember working years ago with Microsoft Limited in the UK, and they had a great program called Empower. There's an Empower people and Microsoft Power. They thought it was cool. And then we came in to research what impact it had had. And we found that actually no one could remember it. And then someone said, oh, yeah, I remember it. It was the one with the red T-shirt. And they realized that actually all people remember, there were so many initiatives going on, so many things changing, all people could remember was the red T-shirt. So what they then agreed to do was to not launch any initiatives for a year. They did no new initiatives. And just as a leadership team, they started to behave in ways they wanted the rest of the organization to behave. So when 12 months later they could come out and say, this is how we're changing, they could say, and we've been doing it for 12 months, so we really mean it now. We've got staying power. So the most important thing in belief is really staying power, being clear what the outcome is, but sticking with it. The second thing that we've talked about is something called the rectangular effect, which is where if you've got something in your mind, you start seeing it a lot. So if you are pregnant, or your partner's pregnant, suddenly you see pregnant women everywhere. If you buy a red car, suddenly there are loads more red cars on the road. And this is what Seb was talking about, emotional infection and contagion. This is the same thing happens when we talk about customers. And so when we talk about customers, suddenly everyone's looking at customers, or thinking about customers, or preparing their next customer story to bring back. I was working with the same utility as the research came from the other day, and I got the top 50 people to stand out, and I said, if you have not spoken to a person in the front line or a customer in the last 2 weeks, please sit down. And amazingly enough, half of them remained standing, which I thought was quite a good result. I mean, a lot of top 50s, you wouldn't get that, and here they did. So that's great. What did you talk about? And I went around talking to them, and it was, I talked about the new rota system, I talked about the tools inventory, I talked about lots of the new systems for this, that, and the other. Lots of things they talked about, but not one of them had talked about customers. And so maybe that's why you're not as customer-focused or customer-oriented as you think you'd like to be, because actually when you're having conversations with people, you're not talking about customers. Now I'll hand over to Seb to build from that.
So Octavius talked about, in particular, what some of the leaders can do. There's another aspect to this, which is cultural. What you can see over here is the correlation or the representation of an internal service culture or internal service climate based on that impact on customer satisfaction and stock market value. So what this is demonstrating, what this is showing, is the fact that actually the way we serve each other internally is directly related to the way we then serve our customers. So this is a cultural climate thing. It's not just about the way in which the front line behave. It's actually the way the front line or the customer-facing people are served. Yeah? And so starting to be able to change, and I think that's one of the reasons why you get that, the graph that we introduced earlier on, which showed the differences in my behavior and other people. It's partly because there are a lot of people who aren't getting great service from the business. And so it actually then makes it quite hard for them to serve their customers. And if we can start to change that climate and start to think, actually, this is a place where I am served well, which then allows me to serve my customers better, you start to see really quite significant increases. And ultimately, it actually comes down to the way in which the individuals are engaged. Are they actually engaged with the business? And how can you start to build? And when people talk about engagement, they think a lot about leadership, they think a lot about management. But actually, there's a really key part of this, which is about an individual's mindset. And by individual, I mean everybody in the business. But actually, are you helping people to be autonomous, resilient, feeling capable, feeling optimistic, and having a sense of purpose? And it's those sorts of mindsets that if you can start to develop in people, you start to see a shift in the culture, you start to see a shift in the internal service climate, and then that leads through to external service. Do we have anybody who rides motorbikes? And here, any bikers at all? A couple of people? A couple of people. I really learned to drive when I started riding a motorbike rather than a car. Because what you realise quite quickly, given the fact that death is about 3 inches from the bottom of your foot, is that you have to attend to your driving. And the only thing you think about is your driving. And you're in a car. And actually, driving's quite low on the list of stuff. I'm sure we've all had that experience when we're driving where you just arrive somewhere, and you think, how did that happen? I've just done my whole commute without actually attending to the journey. And I think it's because we just get into these very fixed habits of mind, these very fixed patterns, and actually our mental presence slightly disappears. It becomes reduced. Tim Galway, who wrote The Inner Game of Tennis and The Inner Game of Golf, and he's written lots of books about where actually to improve performance, the thing you need to do is really start to focus on the key variables of the task at hand. And actually, when we're talking about customers, the key variable is the customer. And yet we are thinking about scripts, and we're thinking about handling times, and we're thinking about new products that we have to push, and everything actually but the customer, in many respects, is the stuff that's going on in our mind, which ends up with really high levels of interference, which ends up with mental interference, which then ends up in less mental presence, which then ends up in indifferent service. And there are other factors as well, actually being able to regulate emotions well, because it can be really quite tough sometimes. So, good quality emotional regulation is really key, as well as being able to show empathy and so on. So that's the frontline know-how. What does that mean from a managerial sense? And there was some research done by a psychologist called Robert Thomas, and he focused on, and I think this is really interesting from the perspective of the frontline and customer-facing individuals. It's like, what are the typical non-managerial career paths? That was the question that he was investigating. And he discovered 5. 2 are pretty positive, 1 is all right, and 2 are not very good. The first one is people who grow in their role. So these are individuals who started off, and actually they're growing, they're starting to understand things. They're feeling better because they're becoming more skilled in the way in which they navigate the business, navigate the customers, and really sort of understand people. The second one is the informal experts, and I'm sure we're all familiar with these in our business. They're the people who get spoken to because they just know how stuff works. They know the way round things. They know how to, the shortcuts and the workarounds that actually help an individual do a better job, but also provide better service for the customer. The third group are the career tourists. And these are individuals who tend to move from one job to another pretty much at the same level within a business or across different businesses. And then the final 2 are less useful in terms of driving great performance, and it's those who work to live. So individuals who turn up because they just want to get paid, and then they can have a good time on Friday or Saturday night, or they just want to pay the gas bill. Now, I'm not making any value judgments about these individuals at all. It's totally understandable. But in terms of engagement and in terms of driving attentiveness, they're quite a hard group to start to convert. And the final group are those who work the system. So what they're thinking about is how can I work the angles of this system to reduce my effort and reduce the amount of energy I have to put into this for the greatest gains. Again, I don't think there are lots of people in businesses who do that, but there are enough that actually act as a drain or an anchor on performance. If we start to think about interventions with our frontline operatives, with our agents, and we treat them all in exactly the same way, you're not going to get the highest level of engagement from that. And what we discovered in doing some customer service work with one of our clients was that actually they had a lot of informal experts, and then we created profiles of these people for this client. They had a lot of informal experts, and they had a lot of people who just sort of worked to live. Now the thing was that those two different groups actually needed quite a different experience in terms of changing their behavior. And if we treated them the same, these guys were thinking, like, this is too foundational for me. I need some stretch. And if we provided the stretch that we gave the informal experts to the people who worked to live, it was too much. It wasn't actually tapping into what motivated them or what they cared about. And so we then need to think slightly differently. We need to be able to tailor an experience so that the people actually feel cared for and treated, and it feels personalized in the same way that we want them to treat our customers. Now, from a management perspective, from a managerial perspective, we also have to educate our managers so they can coach these different types of attitude so that everybody can start to flourish. And each of those different attitudes needs a different approach. So those were our solutions to the challenge. And Octavius is now going to talk about what that might look like in practice.
Very, very quickly, I always think it's interesting to see other people's data and see where it comes from. I'm not going to tell you who this organisation is. They're going through a major customer service turnaround. I will tell you that they are based in the UK. I will tell you that they have a history of, almost as far as memory goes, of declining customer rankings, declining customer service based on external industry measures. So their challenge was, how do we turn this around? And they started a number of the things that Seb's been talking about, and we've talked about in the research. They did a big piece about belief, and the leaders got up and said, we really believe in this. Everyone said, yeah, we've heard that before. So that kind of had a bit of a muted response. But then the leaders went down, and others started talking more about customers, and the old-fashioned dialing calls to report on data got replaced by meetings to talk about customers. So it kind of started to be a shift. And then a lot of work was done to help the frontline managers coach the people on the front line to be attentive, to give good customer experiences, to respond, to listen, and give them some of the skills, some of the know-how that Seb's just been talking about there. It's early days, but I will share with you the graph so far, is that the program was launched at the end of September. There have been continuous declines in customer service, and actually that starts to pick up in January. So they have their first tick up in January, a second one in February, and the indications are that that will continue. So again, it's an interesting story of it takes a little while, but not an enormous amount of time for the outside world to start to see the impact, and that putting these levers in place does start to deliver results.